Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Kantz. I'm an English teacher at the high school next door and also the advisor for the high school's Mosaic Club. Our vision statement looks a lot like this one. I'm also the husband of the wildly popular Mrs. Kantz, 6th grade teacher here at TCMS, who is the advisor for the TCMS Mosaic Club. And as you can see in our vision statement, the very first order of business for us is to create opportunities for people to get together and share and discuss about topics like race and equity. And that's why we have invited a special guest to present to us tonight. So it's my pleasure, on behalf of the Brighton Central School District, to introduce you to Mr. West Cosgrove, the Western New York Coordinator for Rural Migrant Ministries. West spent 20 years working on the U.S. Mexico border, where he founded Project Puente to do educational work with migrants, and Casa Puente, a hospitality house which serves the needs of interns and volunteers working in the nonprofit sector in El Paso. West also served as a lay missionary with Maryknoll, living and working for 8 years in Venezuela. He has a master's degree in religious education from Seattle University, and he received the Border Heroes Award from Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso, Texas, for his years of working for justice and advocating for immigrants' rights along the U.S. Mexico border. I have one special request. If any students haven't signed in yet outside, request that on your way out that you do that, and I promise I will make sure that your teachers get those lists. And now please help me to welcome West to Brighton.
So good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a rainy evening. As Chris mentioned, so my name is West Cosgrove. I work for an organization called Rural Migrant Ministry, and most of our work is with farm workers throughout the state of New York. And so this evening we're going to spend about an hour having a conversation. Again, I was telling Chris and Katie that rather than doing a lecture, I would much prefer that this be a conversation, so please ask questions at any time. We're just going to kind of roll through some themes related to farm workers and to immigrants. And you'll see the connection, I believe. So first of all, how many of you believe that you have some connection to farm workers? Let's see a hand. So can you tell me what connection you have with farm workers?
I think my mom's side of family is at farmers.
So she said, can everybody hear that? She said that her mom's family has had some farm workers in her mom's family. Who else raised their hand that you feel like you have a connection with farm workers? Yes?
Because I buy food everywhere.
That's true. So I was going to say it's kind of a trick question, because we're all connected to farm workers if you eat. How many of you eat food? There you go. So we all have connection to farm workers. How many of you think you have some connection to immigrants? Let's get somebody else. You, sir. What would that connection be?
For me?
Yes.
I'm an immigrant.
He is an immigrant. From where, could I ask?
I grew up in India.
Okay, in India. Somebody else have a connection? Yes, what's your connection? Immigrant from Canada. Okay, so how many of you, let me ask this, are any of you Native American? A few of you are. So 96 or 7% of us in this room also have a connection with immigrants because our families at some point in the past came from somewhere else. So I just think that's a good thing to be aware of from the start is that, yes, we're connected with farm workers, and yes, we're connected with immigrants. So I have a couple other questions. How many of you grow your own food? Some of you do have gardens, urban gardens perhaps, that's good. Where does your food, for those of you that don't grow your own food, where do you go to get your food? You do what? I'm sorry. A salsa garden. Wow, cool. I'd like to try that. Where do you get your food? At Wegmans, probably. So right. And then again, as we've kind of already covered, so then who is responsible for the great food that we all enjoy? Oops, what happened? Here we go. Farm workers. Have any of you ever met a farm worker? How did that happen?
A friend of mine is the charge of the Wegmans farm, and he's the manager of Wegmans farm.
Okay, cool. Because one thing that I've experienced is that you don't see farm workers in Rochester. Farm workers are typically out in the rural areas, and they're often very, very hidden. I mean, you wouldn't even know that they're around. And yet, in the United States, there are 2 to 3 million farm workers, and in the state of New York, between 80 and 100,000 farm workers. And yet, again, they're basically invisible for the most part for the most of us. So, though farm workers are some of our nation's most vital workers, their labor enables us to enjoy high-quality, low-cost fresh fruits and vegetables, yet they continue to be some of the lowest paid, least protected, and unhealthiest workers in the United States. When I moved here 4 years ago to New York, I was really surprised that almost a quarter of New York is a farm. That's over 7 million acres, 36,000 farms in the state of New York, and agriculture is over $6 billion a year industry here. So who knows what state is the #1 producer of Greek yogurt? New York. What state's the #2 producer of apples, maple syrup, and pumpkins? New York. What state is the #3 producer of dairy, grapes, wine, cabbage, and cauliflower? New York. But did you know that farm workers are not guaranteed a day of rest? Farm workers receive no overtime pay. They may work 60, 70, 80 hours a week and they do not get overtime pay. Maybe they don't even get the minimum wage. No right to collective bargaining, and can be fired if they report any abuses. In other words, just without getting into the details, in 1938, when Franklin Roosevelt and Congress passed what we now consider all the basic labor laws that you and I enjoy, again, an 8-hour work day, a day off, overtime pay, collective bargaining rights, etc., the law was written and it said, everyone gets these rights except for domestic workers and farm workers. They literally were excluded from the law. Why would that be? Why would you exclude anybody? This was 1938. Who were farm workers and domestic workers at the time? Some immigrants, but at the time it would have been actually another group of people, more so than immigrants. It's immigrants today, which we're going to talk about. Is your hand up? No? Yeah.
People?
Pardon me?
Black people?
African Americans. Right. And so Franklin Roosevelt had to make a deal with the Southern Democrats at the time, who, of course, were not going to give any rights to African Americans. And so domestic workers and farm workers were excluded. Domestic workers have since been brought in, leaving farm workers as the only group of people. So teachers, engineers, workers like myself, if you work as a busboy, if you pack groceries at Wegmans, if you do anything in the United States, and it doesn't have to do with your immigration status, if I was a farm worker, I would have no rights. That's the law. They're excluded from basic labor rights, labor protections. And yet again, I would say, and not to pick on Chris, your English teacher, But if all high school English teachers disappeared, the world would go on, right? What would happen if all farm workers disappeared? We'd all be in trouble. So it's a really, really important job, and yet they're the only group of people who don't have basic protections, basic rights. Any questions, any comments? Yes?
So they have been like trying to get their rights to kind of have the basic protections.
There have been some efforts. I'm going to mention a couple of them in a moment, and then I'm also going to mention an effort here in the state of New York to try to get farm worker basic rights, and we're going to try to find a way that some of you can participate in that struggle, okay? Would you like to do that, help farm workers?
Yeah, and also, my question is, so if they've been like fighting to get their basic rights, then why haven't the government like changed the law?
Good. Can everybody hear that question? Brilliant question. Very wise question. So why haven't the government changed the law? It doesn't seem fair, does it? And yet, there was an effort to change a piece of the law, and it went to the New York Supreme Court, and they ruled against the farm workers, and they did not change the law. So. But that's a good question about why the government does a lot of things we could apply that question to. Yes, sir?
The farm workers trying to organize, is that against the law?
It is. It is. If the three of you are farm workers and I'm the farmer and I catch you you live in a labor camp, and if you're sitting and I catch you talking about let's get together to try to better our situation, I can fire you and you have no recourse. No collective bargaining, nothing. No rights. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to make sure, because that we know what we're talking about when we talk about farm workers. I think the most common image of farm worker is the migrant farm worker, and that would be the person who migrates, who moves. So they're one time of the year they're in Florida picking oranges. They follow the crop, is what it's called. And then they kind of move up a little bit to peaches and watermelon, they move up a little bit more until they finally end up picking apples in New York, which they're just finishing up the apple picking season right now. I was on a farm 2 days ago, an apple farm, and they had literally just finished the harvest. The workers who they had brought up were going back to Mexico. So those are the people who move. And then there's a lot of year-round workers, so you're moving, you're following the crop, but then you meet a nice person and you get married and you have kids, and then you still move a little bit. You drag your kids along, and your kids change schools a lot, and they work with you in the field sometimes. But then that gets to be kind of a drag, and so people will settle. So there are a lot of farm workers who now settle in Wayne County, was where all the apples are grown, and they live here year-round, and so they'll plant, they'll harvest, they'll prune the trees in the winter, they'll graft new trees, they'll do packaging after they've harvested, so they kind of make a year-round job here. And then there's the H-2A workers, who are the temporary workers. There's just a real problem finding enough workers here, and so there's a government program where if I need 50 workers, but only for the harvest, so only between August, September, October, into November, I apply, etc., and I can bring up 50 workers from Mexico just for those 3 or 4 months. And so a lot of farmers are doing that because it's harder and harder to get workers. Why is that? Are you 4 guys in Mr. Kant's English class? Do you know what you're going to study when you go to college? Anybody? Anybody planning on majoring in fruit and vegetable picking? Anybody at all know anybody who's planning on majoring in fruit and vegetable picking? And yet, how many of us like fresh fruits and vegetables? Yes. And so, but if you go out and talk to farmers, they're going to tell you it's harder and harder to get workers. And it's hard work, low pay, etc. But there's one other big issue that we're going to get to in a moment. Again, please ask questions, interrupt me, make comments, disagree. Yes?
Is there a child labor law for farm workers?
She's asking about child labor law. Yes, I think it's different than child labor laws in any other industry. In other words, you can't get a job at Wegmans, but you can work in the field with your parents. Yeah, and I think, gosh, I should know this. I think the legal age is 12 or above. You can legally, even though you'll see kids younger than 12 in the fields. Yeah, just because that's where they kind of have to be. Yes,
Are
ma'am.
you talking only about the child or children of the farmers?
The
Or
farm-
children of the migrant farm
The
workers?
children of the farm workers.
Okay.
Yes,
I was going to ask where are they least protected?
I'm sorry?
Why are they the least protected?
Who's the least protected?
Why are they the least
Oh, well, again, that's a good question. Why? We know that the law originated, how many years ago is that? 80 years ago, because there was prejudice against black people, against African Americans. Why haven't we changed the law today? That's a good question. I will tell you, and I'll probably get to that slide before we're out of time, is that our other organization and other organizations have been trying to pass a law in New York to remove the exclusion where farm workers would have the same legal labor rights as everybody else. We've been trying to pass that law, and it usually passes in the Assembly, and it always fails in the New York Senate. So, ask your senator. Now, I don't mean to kind of be flip about that, but again, it's like there's some brilliant questions. Whoever students these are should get extra credit for their great questions. So I just want to mention a couple of cases of really good efforts, the kind of the most famous efforts of farm worker organizing or farm worker being present in the United States. Does anyone know of the Bracero program? Does anyone speak Spanish? What does the word brazo mean? Arm. So the Bracero program began in 1942 when mostly men from the United States were in the war in Europe, and we literally needed workers because the men weren't here to do the work. So there were two groups of workers that sort of responded to the call. One of them you may know, Rosie. Who's Rosie? Rosie the Riveter. Who knows Rosie the Riveter? That famous poster. So a lot of women all of a sudden came into the workforce and took over jobs that were typically men. And we asked Mexicans to come and work in the United States during that time. And it was such a successful program that it extended, as you can see, well beyond the war until 1964. And during that time, 4.6 million Mexicans came to the United States, worked legally, and some people would make a case that, like, wow, without them, would we have won the war? Because they filled a lot of gaps. So the Bracero program had some successes, but then there's also some criticism of the way the workers were treated, etc. But the Bracero program is one example when, I think at least, that there was an attempt and recognition that we can work together with people from other countries, and it benefits everybody. Has anyone ever heard of Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta? Who are they?
Well, I've heard of Cesar Chavez, and I just know that he organized strikes.
Exactly, yeah. Cesar Chavez and Dolores. Cesar Chavez is more famous than Dolores Huerta, but they were really both the main lead organizers of what became the Great Boycott. They were trying to figure out a way to get better rights, better conditions for farm workers. They organized unions. That didn't work, and they finally organized a boycott of grapes, because what they would do is they would literally spray pesticides on the grapes while the workers were in the field. And And so they got people to stop buying California grapes, and it was wildly successful, and they won some rights. And then I wanted to mention an effort that's going on today that I think some of you may know of. Apparently, I think in Mrs. Katz's class there's a poster or something, or
We talked about it.
or you've talked about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. These are farm workers in Florida who pick tomatoes. And you can work for 12 hours in the hot Florida sun, pick 2 tons of tomatoes, and you make $50. And not much. I mean, I work for a nonprofit, and I make $50 much quicker, much easier than that. And so the idea that they came up with is we want to make 1 penny a pound more. And so their strategy was to go to these businesses and say, we want you to promise you will only buy your tomatoes from farms that pay us 1 penny a pound more. And at first, none of these companies would do it. But eventually, Taco Bell was the first one that said, okay, we'll sign on. And since then, all of these, Burger King, McDonald's, etc., all the way to Walmart. Walmart is the largest buyer, buys more tomatoes in the United States than any other company. They have also signed on. So now these companies pay the workers or buy tomatoes where the workers get a penny a pound more. There's one company that has not signed on, Wendy's. And frankly, I just don't get it. I mean, I don't get it from the fact that it's the just and right thing to do, but there's a boycott of Wendy's. The workers from Florida, from Immokalee, typically come up once or twice a year. They go to the national headquarters of Wendy's in New York City and have protests, and they get a lot of publicity. And I don't know why Wendy's just doesn't say, okay, we'll give you a penny a pound more. But anyway, so there's a serious protest, a serious boycott of Wendy's. If some of you are looking for something to do, I admit I miss my Frosties at Wendy's. I like that chocolate Frosty, but I don't go to Wendy's right now until they sign on. So there are some efforts, have been some efforts to try to get rights for farm workers, but we haven't gotten to where we'd like to be. So this is just real quick. So here in New York, we call it the Justice for Farm Worker campaign. And there's a bill called the Farm Worker Fair Labor Practices Act that we would like to pass in the state of New York, so that New York could lead the way in giving farm workers rights. And if this bill passed, it would mean that farm workers, like the rest of us, would work only 8 hours, or if they worked more, they'd get paid overtime. They'd get a day off if they choose, because a lot of workers want to work straight through because they make more money. But if they wanted a day off, they had the right to at least 1 day off a week, etc., etc. So those are the things that farm workers would gain. So this is another thing that if you're so inclined to kind of legislative work, that I could get some information to your teachers, and we could, we could have you write letters to your senator to say, vote in favor of farm worker rights. That'd be a cool thing. So I'm gonna switch a little bit from farm workers into immigrants. And in case you're wondering what's the connection, not just are most farm workers from some other country. I've been on a lot of farms and into a lot of fields, and other than the farmer, him or herself, you just don't see white faces, in all honesty. So not only are they from some other country, but 60 to 70% of all farm workers are actually undocumented immigrants. They're in the country without legal immigration status. And if you go to dairy farms, it could be up to 80%, because working in a dairy farm is just really even harder than working at picking fruits and vegetables. Does that surprise anybody? Is that new? Is that not surprising? Any comments, questions?
What makes it harder?
Why is working on a dairy farm hard? It's 24 hours a day. Cows have to be milked multiple times. The job of working on a dairy farm is hooking up the machine to the cows, and how do I say this in a cleaning up after the cows. It's just messy, stinky work. You work 12-hour shifts, night and day, winter, summer, etc., etc. You rarely leave the farm. I know some dairy farm workers that rarely venture off, in part because they're afraid of being picked up by Border Patrol. Yes, you haven't heard from you yet.
When they wear long sleeves and long pants.
Can you say it a little bit louder, please?
When they wear long sleeves and long pants while they're working, don't they get heat stroke?
Some workers do suffer some small and sometimes some big health issues. Yeah, I mean, I know a number of workers who have been kicked by cows, but yeah, it's very, very cold in the winter, obviously, and it can be very hot and heat stroke in the summer. Good question. Yes?
So why is it, like, if it's harder to work in a dairy farm, why is the percentage of undocumented immigrants working in dairy farms higher?
I think it's just because it's even harder work than picking an apple. So I went to visit a farmer who is also a labor contractor a couple of weeks ago, and Cliff's job is to find workers for farms. He was working with, I think 37 farms. Yeah, I believe it was 37 farms. He needed to find a total of 800 workers for these 37 farms. The law requires, and this is a valid point, in other words, because one of the things you hear about immigrants, right, is they're taking jobs from U.S. citizens. And so the law requires that Cliff has to advertise in 2 different states for 2 months, local newspapers, etc. He has to make a serious attempt to hire you and me, or to give us a chance at that job. In those 2 months, they got 3 calls. And they're pretty sure those 3 calls were 3 people on unemployment who, you know, to get your next unemployment check, you have to show that you're making an effort to find a job. So you have to make 5 calls a week or something. No one actually came to their office and said, I'll take that job. You made $12.83 an hour, etc., and no one, not one single person, showed up for that job. Because they're hard jobs. You work long hours, you have no rights, etc., etc. And so we have to import labor. And so we have some workers who are the H-2A workers who come up, and they come up legally for these 3 or 4 months of the harvest, but the rest of the workers who work year-round, most of them are not only working on the farms, but they're hiding from the Border Patrol. Because they're in the country illegally. Yes? Well, I don't know if the machines themselves are dangerous, but you can see this cow, like that may not feel good for the cow, and so they could just do a little kick. That happens quite frequently. That I know a number of dairy farm workers who have been kicked by cows. Yes? Yes, that's exactly what she said. Is that cow manure? And I said, yes, that's the other part of the job, is to clean up after the cows. And that's another reason why it's not a highly sought after job. I don't know if it's toxic. I mean, I've been there when they're cleaning up after the cows, and I don't think they're not wearing masks. It smells bad, but I don't think it's necessarily toxic. Yes?
So if they're all undocumented immigrants and it's
Great question. Absolutely great question. So, the question is that we know that 60 to 70% of the people who pick our fruits and vegetables, who milk the cows, are in the country illegally. How is that possible? Anybody want to try to answer her question? Yes.
Because they don't arrest the farmers or the big industrialists who own the farms.
That's exactly it. So here's what the law is. So if you arrive in the country and you came from Mexico and you snuck into across the border, I lived on the U.S. Mexico border for 20 years. And so if you swim the river, the Rio Grande, into Texas, or you come into Arizona through the desert, and you know that you're going to come to New York, you make your way to New York, and the first thing you do is go get a fake Social Security card. Because a farm worker, just like someone who teaches here at the school, when you get a job, you have to show a Social Security card. So you show up and you give me your Social Security card, and I look at it and I make a copy of it, and I give it back to you, and I put the copy in the file. If the Border Patrol ever shows up and says, West, we think you have an undocumented worker, they haul you away. I go to the copy and I look at that and I say, looks good to me. I am not required to be an expert in counterfeit documents, so you get deported and I hire someone who's coming in behind you. So the reality is, and again, this is a tricky question. I wish that everybody in the country was here legally. I'm certainly not an open borders person. I don't know a single person who is an open borders person. But I also recognize that these four guys, the people at RIT, they're not majoring. When I speak with university groups, I ask that question every single time. Who's majoring in fruit and vegetable picking? I've probably spoken with hundreds of university groups. No one raises their hand, but everyone wants fruit and vegetables. And so we just need to make it possible that folks can come legally and work. When I ask farm workers what's the number one thing they'd like to change in their reality, it's not more pay, it's not better working conditions, it's let us do this legally with dignity. They want immigration reform. Farmers want immigration reform. I went to another farm a number of months ago before the harvest started, and these two, it's a father-son farm, the DeBot's farm, and they were saying how they just can't get workers. They're having to go to this H-2A system because that's all that's available to them. Because of the immigration situation today, people are afraid to come. Fewer and fewer workers are here. So they have to do this, they don't want to do this. They used to have a steady workforce, a year-round workforce that they like, et cetera, and now that's gone. So farmers want immigration reform so they can get workers. And so that's why the immigration issue is just so linked with the farm worker issue and the food issue. Yes, ma'am.
Would you say that farm workers generally are for immigration reform and rights for workers?
Yes, but when like I say, that comes a little bit later. Like when you have that, if you would sit down and have dinner with them, like if we would say, okay, I told Katie that if we had a little bit more time tonight, I could have brought a farm worker to kind of join the conversation tonight. But in my experience, almost always their number one thing that they would change is not so much labor laws or, like I say, that the housing is better or that they get a little bit better salary. It's the fear of deportation. I occasionally go with a farm worker to their deportation trial, to their immigration trial, and I went a few weeks ago to Buffalo with Nacho, and Nacho has 3 kids here. And Nacho's probably going to be deported because he got stopped on he was speeding. And the state trooper eventually called the Border Patrol. Nacho got picked up, detained for a month or so, got out of jail. Anyway, Nacho's 3 kids might lose their father. The farmer went with us to immigration trial. That's how supportive the farmer is of Nacho and his workers. It's one of these what do you call the situation? In other words, the farmer's in, Nacho is up there telling his story, admitting that he entered the country illegally in front of his boss. The next day, Nacho's back at work. I mean, so whoever is asking the question, whoever that was about, yes, all the farmers know that most of these people are working illegally. And yet it's their only option to get the crops in. Yes?
You use the term open border.
Mhm.
Where's the actual?
Sometimes you hear people talk about people like me who sometimes work in favor of immigration reform, or sometimes sometimes give talks that we should make things better for immigrants. Sometimes they kind of go to the extreme and say, oh, you just want to let everybody in for free. Like have a border where people can come from any country and just come in. And it's like, no, I don't. Who would want that? I mean, that's crazy. I don't know a single person who says open the border. I do know people who believe, I'm one of them, that our immigration system could be greatly improved. And again, it's not, you can make a case that immigration reform would be the moral, ethical thing to do, or you could just be selfish and say, gosh, who's going to pick the fruit and vegetables? Who's going to do this job, that job? Who's going to work in landscaping? Who's going to work in the restaurants? Who's going to do all the jobs that undocumented immigrants do? Just be selfish. And for selfish reasons, we should better our immigration system, in my opinion. Yes?
So if someone can't work against steps, you can get into that.
There are clinics that make healthcare available to people regardless of their immigration status. So whether you're here legally or not, you can go to these clinics and they do not ask you your immigration status. And sometimes they'll even go on to the farms to give certain services like vaccinations and things like that. In fact, I know of one clinic that just got a mobile mammogram. They're going to take that on into labor camps for women, farm workers. Yes, sir?
Are there states that have made more progressive laws to advocate for farm workers' rights?
Yes, there are some states. I mean, California is the best known because of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and there are a few other states that have made little tiny inroads, but nobody has gone, like what I would say, done what we are trying to do here in New York, where farm workers have exactly the same labor rights as you and I. Nobody has done that. And that's why we really would like New York to lead the way and show that it's possible and doable and beneficial for all. So just real quickly again, we're a nation of immigrants. A few of you raised your hand, but in the last census, less than 1% said they're Native American. So basically, 99% of us are immigrants. And yet we still have these debates and even fights about what to do with immigrants. We're still trying to work it out, aren't we? I would even say that human beings are a migratory species. How many of you were born in Rochester? Now we have a young crowd here, so it's probably a little bit, well, even so, some of you, yes, but with the point being is that humans move. Moving, migrating is a human thing to do. It's not a bad thing to do. You move for good reasons, you get a new job, you go off to college, whatever. Sometimes people are forced to move for bad reasons because where they live is dangerous or etc. You know, there's reasons. So people move. We've always moved for as humans, and it's not a bad thing. Now, obviously, it gets tricky when you cross international borders. In case you've never been to the U.S. Mexico border, this guy's in Mexico. This guy is stepping into the United States. That's how easy it is in some places. So, just real quickly, again, why do immigrants come to the United States? Well, we talk about push factors. Sometimes they're being pushed out of where they live because of poverty, because of violence, etc. They come here for the same reasons that our parents, grandparents, other folks, our ancestors came. Then They were good reasons then, and they're still good reasons. And then we talk about the pull factors, that if you get here, you can probably get a job, even though it's technically illegal. So you can see here's some of the jobs that undocumented immigrants take and some of the services they provide for us. Again, with my point being is that when we talk about the immigration issue is something that it's fair to have different opinions on, but I just think to kind of start from this basic understanding that being a migrating person, moving is not a bad thing. In fact, we all do it. Most of us will move many times during our lives. Here's a really good question. Why don't people just come legally? I get asked that all the time. You hear that on the news. Why don't they just go down and fill out the form and get in line and come legally? Well, it requires a deep discussion to really delve in, but I want to give you one example of why people don't come, or why someone might not come legally. So if you don't believe me, you can go home and Google the words visa bulletin, and that will take you to the State Department website where you can get this information. So the visa bulletin, the State Department comes out every month with a new visa bulletin, and they tell you where they're at in the process of processing visas from X country or Y country. I picked Mexico because most of the undocumented persons in the United States are from Mexico. So this month, November of 2018, this month, the State Department, let's say that I came from Mexico many, many years ago when it was easier. Now I'm a U.S. citizen, and now I want to bring, number one, my unmarried children. This month, the State Department is processing visas submitted on or before August of 1997. It's a 21-year wait if you want to do it legally. Unmarried adult children of legal permanent residence, that's someone with a green card, 1997. Married children, 1995. If I want to bring my siblings, 1998. So it's a 20 to 21 to 22-year wait to bring legally a family member. And you'll sometimes hear somebody say, oh, they're bringing the 13th cousin. That's not true. It has to be your children or your siblings or your spouse. I didn't put spouse on there because spouse is usually a little bit quicker, but even that's a couple of years. But in other words, here's the question I want to ask all of you, and particularly those of you who are parents. If you were separated from your children, you came here years ago to get a job, send money back home, and now you've been here long enough that you're a U.S. citizen, you want to bring your children, are you cool waiting 21 years more? It's just not reasonable. It's just not, and so I would say that I want everyone in the United States to be here legally. But you can't say come legally unless there's some way to come legally. And I don't think this really qualifies. Again, that's my opinion. If there is no way that you go down to the immigration department, fill out a form, wait a couple of months, and that does not exist. Okay? It's very hard to immigrate with an E. You can get a tourist visa to go to Disneyland. You can come as a student. That's different. If you want to pack up and move you and your family here, that is very, very, very difficult. Unless you're from Finland, Norway, some European country that is mostly Anglo. Those countries, it's easier. Every country has a quota and is different. So the undocumented question is a real valid question. But we just have to kind of delve into, so why do these folks come illegally? Well, this is one of the legal reasons. Yes? She's asking what's happening in the picture. This woman is in Mexico. This is one of the fences on the border that has been cut, and so she's reaching through and touching her grandchild. That's outside of El Paso, where I used to live. Other questions, comments? Yes?
So one of your bullet points, and thank you very much for coming here, and I just wanted to ask you if you could highlight a little bit about what conditions migrant farm workers live on the farms in New York. And one of your bullet points is about their housing. And I just feel like if you could just spend maybe one more minute talking about the housing conditions that migrant farm workers have to live in.
I think it varies, of course. All farms, in other words, if you're like some of the people that I know best are the year-round workers, because we work with them and their children. And one of the other things my organization does a lot is work with the youth, the children of farm workers. And so, but these are the farm workers who are here all year round. They very, very often, not entirely, but they very often live in trailers that are in various degrees of repair. I've seen better, I've never seen horrendous, in all honesty. So that would be the year-round workers. The H-2A workers who come for 3 or 4 months for the harvest, I've seen some pretty bad places. I'm surprised that they have to be inspected. And I've seen some places that I don't know how they passed inspection, in all honesty. I mean, they're leaky, there's no insulation. Now, they usually get out of here before the winter. Like literally at the farm I was at on, what did I say, Monday, Tuesday? They had literally finished, and today and tomorrow, the H-2A, the temporary workers, are flying back to Mexico. The farmer, that's part of the farmer's responsibility. He or she has to bring them here, pay for their transportation, house them, pay them a certain wage. And so they were all getting ready to return home. Their housing, I thought, was pretty bad. We actually took a little bit of, we had an event on Sunday, and we had some food left over. And so we took these big pots of chicken mole and some soup out to share. And we said, bring your pots out and they hardly had pots to put it in. And I was like, how can you put 10 guys in this trailer? And I didn't think they had adequate cooking utensils, in my opinion. So it just runs the gamut. I mean, the people who are here year-round, they have kids, it's not great living, but I think they're mostly comfortable, in all honesty. Yes?
Does it take longer for, like, say, a mother to bring a child that's 2 or a mother that's bringing a person that's 34 with their child?
Well, that's a really good question. Can I go backwards? Because this is worth mentioning. What's your name? Ella, how old are you?
I'm
11. So let's say that I'm Ella's dad, and now I'm a citizen, and so I want to bring Ella and I want to bring my 4 daughters to the United States legally. So are you married yet? No, okay, so they're in the first category. They're unmarried. If you get married during that 20-year wait, which I would, possible at least, likely, you switch categories and start all over. If you go from unmarried to married, new category, new form to fill out. So it matters not so much your age, but whether you're married or not. Yes? Well, you fall in love. Things happen. It's just, you're back home, you don't know if your mom or dad is ever going to be able to get you to the United States, and you fall in love in Mexico and you get married. Anybody married want to answer that question? Why? Yes? Why are they waiting so long? The main reason is because there's so many people in line. I have a slide, a longer presentation that's just on immigration, and that I didn't include this evening. But I can tell you this, the numbers, I remember the numbers, is there are 4,700,000 people worldwide waiting who have applied for one of these visas to bring a family member. 1,400,000 are from Mexico. So when we think, are we going to get mad at these Mexicans, 1 million, because they just don't get in line and because they just break the law, well, 1,400,000 are trying to do it legally. I'll be honest with you, I knew people in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, which is across the border. We would work on both sides of the border. I met people who had applied for a visa and began to wait, and they waited years and years and years. They had no idea of these numbers, and after a number of years, they said, I can't wait any longer. I miss her. I miss my little beautiful daughter, son, and they brought them through other means. And I'm a parent. I have 3 beautiful daughters and 2 beautiful granddaughters, and I can't tell you that I wouldn't do the same. I won't ask you necessarily what you would do. Let me get this guy back here because he hasn't had a chance yet.
Isn't there like a big problem that there's like 7 billion or million people coming in?
No, I thought you were going to say there's that many people on the planet. Yes.
No.
What was the question? I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood you.
Like 7,000 or something like that are immigrating.
Oh, are you talking about this? The migrant caravan that's in the news today?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that's why I just wanted to bring this up as we come to an end, because it is in the news today. And I thought, is your question about this? Mm-hmm.
So what does those states represent?
Those dates?
Yeah.
That means, so I work in the State Department processing visas. The line is so long. Today, I'm working on visas that were submitted 20 years ago. That's how far backed up the system is. You weren't even born when somebody submitted a visa to try to bring their son or daughter, and and the other thing that could happen is, so I'm the person in the State Department. That just means that today I'm going to pull your file and begin to consider it, and one of the options is I just hit rejected, denied. That's one of the real things that can happen after that 20-something year wait. Yes?
Are they really like actual lines?
No, they filled that visa out. So God would go down to the immigration offices here in Rochester, and I would fill out the application to bring my children who live in Mexico to come and live with me. But so if I would have filled that out 20 years ago, I'm still waiting for the people in the State Department to even consider my application. I know it's inconceivable. She's like got this, I wish you could see her face. She's like, what? Well, let's wrap up. I think it's probably time to wrap up. So I just wanted to put this out because it is in the news, and it's being spoken a lot about. And so I thought we could have a 2 or 3 minute conversation about the migrant caravan. So the numbers I've heard are 3,000, 5,000, 7,000, mostly people from Honduras, which is the most violent country in the Western Hemisphere, have left Honduras and crossed through Guatemala and crossed into Mexico, and here they are, somewhere in Mexico, on their way north. Anyone have any sort of just general comments about how you're feeling about this? What do you believe about it? What have you heard about it? Yes?
I was just wondering, like, how many, what are the places that everyone's coming from?
Today, most of the undocumented people in the country that we're upset about are from Latin America. Mostly Mexico. Over 50% of the undocumented are from Mexico, and then it would be a variety of other Latin American countries. Mainly, then Central American countries where most of these folks are from. So, yes?
I know this isn't a simple question, but can you speak a little bit about the process of the individual themselves gaining citizenship? You've been speaking about getting...
Like, so I came, how did I get citizenship before I bring my family?
Right.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, again, if you have entered the country illegally, you cannot, well, okay, that's not true. very rare occasion, or very rarely, can you switch your status to some legal status. There are a few exceptions to that, but they're exceptions. So for instance, because again, when I lived on the border, I'll give you a good example. A guy named Armando, he had come into the United States, I don't know how long ago, got married, had a couple of kids, and so for him to adjust his status to become a legal resident, you have to leave the country. You have to go back to Mexico and make your application there. With an exception of, you can possibly get a waiver. So Armando lived in Minnesota. I had a friend in Minnesota who contacted me and said Armando has to leave the country. He showed up in El Paso with a foot of documents. You know, sworn affidavits from his family, his boss, his pastor, all kinds of people saying this is a good man, he should be allowed to stay here, he's married, he's got 3 kids, he's not going to cause any problems, he's won these awards, etc. He still had to cross into Ciudad Juarez, go to the U.S. consulate in Ciudad Juarez, and make his application without knowing if he would get back into the United States or not. He did. They granted him the waiver, gave him a legal status, and he came back and went back to Minnesota. But even this guy, that's what it requires. Because once you've entered illegally, you have what's called a ban. If you're deported, so like if I come in, if I sneak in and I get caught and I'm deported back to Mexico, I have what's called I can't come back for, I think on the first offense, it's only something like 6 months. But then if I come back and get caught again, then I have a 10-year ban before I can even, you can't do anything. You can't even make an application from Mexico. So it's possible, but really very, very difficult to adjust your status if you've entered illegally. If you came in, there's kind of two types of undocumented, and we could delve more into this if we, and they're about half of the estimated 11 million people literally snuck into the United States. The other half are what's called overstays. So they came into the United States with a visa, a tourist visa, a student visa, which said you've now graduated from RIT on May 31st of 2018. You have to go home, and you just stayed. But now you're as undocumented as the person who snuck in. That's about half of the 11 million. It's about half and half. But if you did come in originally with a visa, you have a little bit more possibility of adjusting your status than if you just never had a visa. Okay, I'll take your questions, then we'll wrap up, because I just want to say something about this and then we'll finish. Yes?
Is it so complicated like with other countries?
You mean are other countries' immigration laws different? Every country's immigration law are different, yes. And I'm not familiar, obviously, with other countries' immigration laws. Sometimes you hear things about Canada. Canada seems to be much more immigrant-friendly than the United States in what I know, but I don't know the details of their immigration law. Some countries would have harder immigration laws than the United States. Yes?
If you enter illegally, can you bring a family member in legally?
No. You can't bring anybody legally until you're here legally. Okay, last question, then we're going to deal with this and be done. Oh, shoot. Okay. Yes. Then you get the last question.
So if they have so many visas they have to leave, they get more people to meet them.
Get more people to what? I'm sorry.
If they get more people to meet them and give them out, if they have.
Yeah, in other words, one thing that we could do is to get through this process would be to hire more people who work at the State Department to process visas. Yeah. So here's the point I want to make about this migrant caravan. Whether you believe that there are invaders, whether you believe they have a right to do this or not, whether you're on this side of the argument, this is the photo you most often see. But I want to say that we don't see who really is in this migrant caravan. Oops. It's women and children. These are real photos from the caravan. It's a father or a brother carrying his little, it's a mom and a baby. I mean, these are human beings who are fleeing violence, mainly violence, some poverty in Honduras. They're moving. I'm not in favor of opening the borders. We can't, I agree, of course we can't take all the people who have problems in the world, of course, but I just can't, the rhetoric on both sides, I just can't, I barely can even listen to the news about it. And I'm kind of a news junkie. I just think that we really need a, you know, some really heartfelt reflection as a nation about who we are. 99% of us are immigrants. And, you know, a little compassion and a little bit of, I mean, I've already seen photos at the border. We're going to send 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 troops to the border to keep that mom and baby out. I mean, we have 15,000 people in Afghanistan, my goodness. So there are a lot of things to debate. We can honestly have different opinions on this, but I would just encourage us all to mix in a little compassion and a little bit of really reflection on how we got to this place and where these people are coming from and why and who they are. So these are, we're no time for this.
Can you
What?
go back and just take a picture of it?
I think we're out of time, so I don't know how you want to end. So these are just some things that I always think that people are looking sometimes for things, practical things to do. Don't buy that Frosty at Wendy's, the good one. Maybe later on, once we elect a new Senate, maybe we'll be able to pass the Farm Worker Fair Labor Practices Act. And then the other thing is, again, we won't get, these are just some of the projects that we work on, that we do out of our office. And I think that's it.
Thank you.